The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Galactic Institute of Advanced Studies. Professor Yong Ho Park sat in his office, looking at the student file on his desk. His crystalline body sparkled as he moved, tiny rainbow patterns dancing on the walls around him. The professor was not happy. He had just received news that would change his perfectly organized classroom. A human student, he said to himself, his voice making a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Why did they have to send me a human student? The professor had taught for over 300 years. He had worked with students from 50 different planets. Some had 6 arms, others had no arms at all. Some breathed methane, while others didn't breathe at all. But he had never taught a human before. Professor Park picked up the file again. The student's name was Do-Young Lee. She was from Earth, a planet that had only joined the Galactic Federation 20 years ago. The professor knew very little about humans, except what everyone else knew. They were fast, unpredictable, and lived very short lives. Only 80 years, he mumbled, shaking his head. His own species lived for at least 1,000 years. How can they learn anything meaningful in such a short time? A soft knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. It was his assistant, Kita, a tall, blue-skinned being from the water world of Aquarius Prime. "Professor," Kita said, his gills fluttering nervously, "the new human student has arrived early. She's waiting in the main hall." Professor Park's crystalline form flickered with surprise. The semester wasn't supposed to start for another 3 days. This was exactly the kind of unpredictable behavior he had heard about humans. "Very well," he sighed. "I will meet her." The professor followed Kita through the school's wide corridors. The halls were mostly empty, with only a few early arriving students floating, walking, or gliding about. The building itself was a marvel of galactic architecture, with ceilings that reached 50 meters high and walls that changed color based on the time of day. When they reached the main hall, Professor Park stopped suddenly. Among the few beings present, the human was easy to spot. Do-Young Lee stood near a large window, looking out at the purple mountains in the distance. Unlike what the professor had expected, she wasn't wearing a bulky environmental suit. Instead, she wore the standard institute uniform, adapted slightly for her human form. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, and she carried a simple backpack over one shoulder. "Miss Lee," Professor Park called out, his crystalline voice echoing in the large hall. Do-Young turned quickly, much more quickly than the professor was used to seeing anyone move. Her face broke into what he recognized as a human smile. She walked over to them with smooth, efficient movements that reminded the professor of some of the predatory species he had taught in the past. "Professor Park," she said, bowing slightly in what he knew was a sign of respect in her culture. "Thank you for meeting me. I hope I'm not causing any trouble by arriving early." The professor noticed that she spoke perfect galactic standard, without any translation device. This was unusual. Most new students needed at least a few weeks to adjust to the standard language. "Not at all," he lied politely. "May I ask why you've arrived before the semester begins?" Do-Young's smile grew wider. "I wanted to get used to the environment, and maybe get a head start on my studies. I read that your quantum computing class is one of the most challenging in the galaxy. I don't want to waste any time." Professor Park's crystalline structure flickered again, this time with a mixture of surprise and what might have been approval. Perhaps this human understood the value of proper preparation after all. "Very well," he said. "Kita will show you to your quarters. They have been adapted to Earth standard conditions." "Oh, that wasn't necessary," Do-Young said quickly. "I can adapt to most environments. Humans are quite flexible that way." This was news to Professor Park. He had assumed humans needed carefully controlled conditions like many other species. He made a mental note to update his knowledge about Earth's inhabitants. Over the next 3 days, Professor Park kept noticing Do-Young in various parts of the institute. She was always doing something productive, studying in the library, practicing in the quantum labs, or talking with the few other early arrival students. She seemed to need very little rest, working long hours and only stopping for short periods to eat or sleep. When the semester finally began, the professor's classroom filled with students from across the galaxy. There were the gas-breathing nebulans in their floating spheres, the silicon-based crystallites, like himself, the aquatic aquarians in their water suits, and many others. Du Young sat in the front row, her tablet ready and her eyes alert. "Welcome to Advanced Quantum Computing," Professor Park began. "This class will challenge you in ways you've never been challenged before. We will explore the very fabric of reality itself, bending the rules of quantum mechanics to create the most advanced computing systems in the known universe." As he spoke, he noticed something odd. While most students were still setting up their learning interfaces or adjusting their environmental controls, Du Young was already taking notes. Her fingers moved across her tablet with incredible speed, yet her eyes never left the professor. "For our first lesson," he continued, "we will review the basic principles of quantum entanglement and its application in computing. Please access the course materials I'm sending now." A complex diagram appeared on the main display, showing the interconnected nature of quantum particles. Professor Park began his explanation, but before he could finish his first point, Du Young's hand shot up. "Yes, Miss Lee?" he asked, slightly annoyed at the interruption. "Professor, I noticed that the diagram shows the traditional approach to quantum entanglement, but wouldn't it be more efficient to consider the multidimensional approach developed by Professor Kim from Seoul University? It could reduce the computational overhead by at least 40%. The room fell silent. Professor Park stared at the human student. Professor Kim's work was not part of the standard curriculum. In fact, it was so new that most experts in the field hadn't had time to fully review it yet. You're familiar with Professor Kim's work?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I read her paper on the flight here. It seemed relevant to your class, so I thought I should study it. I also read your own papers on crystalline quantum computing. Your work on using organic crystalline interfaces is fascinating." Professor Park felt his crystalline structure warm slightly, the equivalent of a blush in his species. His research was highly technical and usually only read by other experts in the field. The rest of the class proceeded in a similar fashion. Every question the professor asked, Du Young answered not just correctly, but with additional insights that showed deep understanding. She worked through complex quantum equations with ease, often finding solutions faster than the advanced computing systems could verify them. By the end of the class, Professor Park wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned. He had never seen anyone, human or otherwise, absorb and process information so quickly. As the students filed out, he called Du Young to stay behind. "Miss Lee," he said, once they were alone, "I must admit I'm puzzled. Your understanding of quantum computing seems to be already at an advanced level. Why did you enroll in this class?" Du Young adjusted her backpack strap, looking slightly embarrassed. "To be honest, Professor, I'm here to learn your perspective. Earth's approach to quantum computing is still new. We've only had the technology for a few decades. Your species has been working with quantum systems for thousands of years. I want to understand how you think about these problems, not just how to solve them." Professor Park felt his crystal structure vibrate with what might have been pleasure. This was not what he had expected from a human student at all. Perhaps he had been too quick to judge based on old stereotypes. "Very well, Miss Lee. But I warn you, this class will become much more challenging as we proceed." Du Young smiled again, and for a moment, the professor thought he saw a glint of something in her eyes. Excitement, perhaps, or even mischief. "I'm counting on it, Professor," she said, then turned and walked out of the classroom with that same smooth, efficient movement that still made him slightly nervous. Professor Park watched her go, then turned to look out the window at the purple mountains in the distance. In all his years of teaching, he had never encountered a student quite like this. He had a feeling that this semester would be very different from any he had taught before. Little did he know just how right he was, or how much his understanding of humans, and of teaching itself, would change in the weeks to come. 2 weeks had passed since Do-Young Lee joined Professor Park's quantum computing class. The crystal body professor watched with growing interest as his human student continued to surprise everyone around her. She didn't just complete her assignments quickly. She found new ways to solve problems that even the teaching assistants hadn't considered. One morning, Professor Park sat in his office, holding a small quantum crystal between his shimmering fingers. The crystal glowed with a soft blue light as he thought about his unusual student. His assistant Kita floated nearby in his water suit, organizing class materials on a holographic screen. "Kita," the professor said suddenly, making the water-breathing assistant's gills flutter in surprise. "I think it's time we gave our students the weekly challenge." Kita's blue skin turned slightly pale. "But Professor, isn't it too early? We usually wait until mid-semester for that." Professor Park's crystal body sparkled with determination. "The class is progressing faster than usual. I believe it's because of our human student. I want to see what she's truly capable of." The weekly challenge was famous, or perhaps infamous, among students at the Galactic Institute. It was a complex problem that usually took the brightest students a full week to solve. Some students needed the entire week just to understand what the question was asking. Later that day, in the massive classroom with its color-changing walls and floating desks, Professor Park announced the challenge. Do-Young sat in her usual spot in the front row, her dark eyes focused on the holographic display above the professor's desk. "Today," Professor Park began, his crystalline voice ringing clear through the room, "we will begin the weekly challenge. Your task is to design a quantum computing system that can manage the energy flow of a Dyson sphere." A quiet murmur spread through the classroom. A Dyson sphere was a massive structure built around a star to capture all of its energy. Even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had trouble managing the enormous power such structures created. "You will have exactly 1 galactic standard week to complete this task," the professor continued. "That's 168 Earth hours. You may use any resources in the Institute's library, but you must work alone. Your solution must be original. And..." The professor stopped speaking. Do-Young's hand was already in the air, her tablet displaying complex equations and diagrams. "Miss Lee," Professor Park said, trying to keep his voice steady, "do you have a question about the assignment?" "No, Professor," Do-Young replied with a small smile. "I have a solution." The classroom erupted in confused noises. The Nebulon students' gas spheres turned dark with shock. The crystallite students flickered rapidly. Even the usually calm Aquarians like Kita rippled their fins in surprise. Professor Park's crystal body dimmed slightly. "Miss Lee, perhaps you didn't understand. This is an extremely complex problem that requires careful..." "I understand completely, Professor," Do-Young said politely. "Would you like me to explain my solution?" The professor stared at his human student for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Please proceed." Do-Young stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. She connected her tablet to the main display, and suddenly the air was filled with detailed holographic models and equations. "The traditional approach to managing Dyson sphere energy relies on quantum gates processing information one level at a time," she began. "But I noticed something while studying Earth's old power grids. Our ancestors used something called a distributed network, where many small systems work together to manage power flow." Her fingers moved quickly across her tablet, and a holographic display changed to show a new kind of quantum circuit design. "By combining this old Earth concept with modern quantum computing, we can create a system where millions of tiny quantum processors work together. Each processor handles a small part of the energy flow, but they're all connected through quantum entanglement." The class watched in stunned silence as Do-Young explained her solution. She had not only solved the problem, she had created an entirely new way of thinking about quantum energy management. "The best part," she continued, her eyes bright with excitement, "is that this system can adapt itself. If one part of the Dyson sphere is receiving more solar energy than another, The quantum network automatically adjusts to balance the load. It's similar to how human blood vessels expand or contract to regulate blood flow. Professor Park felt his crystal structure vibrate with amazement. Du Young had taken a problem that usually stumped students for a week and solved it in minutes. Not only that, but she had used ideas from Earth's past and human biology to create something new. "Miss Lee," he said when she finished her explanation, "how did you develop this solution so quickly?" Du Young shrugged, a very human gesture that the professor was starting to recognize. "I've been thinking about Dyson sphere management since I first learned about them back on Earth. When you announced the challenge, I already had most of the ideas in my head. I just needed to put them together." The professor noticed something interesting. While his other students looked shocked or even discouraged by Du Young's quick solution, they were also taking detailed notes. The human's unusual approach had opened their minds to new ways of thinking. "Very well," Professor Park said. "Since Miss Lee has completed the weekly challenge early, perhaps we can spend the rest of the week analyzing her solution and discussing possible improvements." Du Young's face lit up. "Actually, Professor, I have 3 more possible solutions we could look at. Each one approaches the problem from a different angle. I thought it might be interesting to compare them." Kaita, who had been floating quietly in his corner, made a sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. Professor Park felt his crystal structure warm with what he now recognized as amusement. "3 more solutions?" he asked. "Yes," Du Young said. "The first one uses ideas from Earth's weather patterns. The second is based on how our brains process information. And the third—" She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "Well, the third one was inspired by how my grandmother used to organize her kitchen." For the first time in his 300 years of teaching, Professor Park did something completely unprofessional. He laughed. The sound was like crystal wind chimes in a storm, and it made all the students jump in surprise. "Miss Lee," he said when he recovered, "I believe you are going to force me to completely redesign my teaching methods." "I'm sorry, Professor," Du Young said, looking worried. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "No trouble at all," the professor replied. "In fact, I haven't been this interested in teaching since my first century at the Institute. Now, please show us these other solutions of yours, especially the one about your grandmother's kitchen. I have a feeling we all have much to learn from Earth's way of doing things." As Du Young began explaining her other solutions, Professor Park noticed something remarkable. The other students were no longer just taking notes. They were asking questions, making suggestions, and building on Du Young's ideas with concepts from their own cultures and worlds. The weekly challenge, which was supposed to take 7 days, had turned into something much more valuable in just a few minutes. It had become a bridge between different ways of thinking, a chance for species from across the galaxy to learn from each other. And it had all started because one human student wasn't afraid to think differently, to solve problems in new ways, and to share her ideas with others. The professor made another mental note. Perhaps he needed to update not just his knowledge about humans, but his entire understanding of how learning worked in the galaxy. After all, if a species that lived less than 100 years could think so quickly and creatively, what else might they be capable of teaching the rest of the galaxy? News of Du Young's quick solution to the weekly challenge spread through the Galactic Institute like a wave. In the days that followed, professors from other departments started showing up at Professor Park's classroom. They stood quietly at the back, their various forms casting interesting shadows on the color-changing walls as they watched the human student with great interest. One morning, Professor Park arrived at his office to find an urgent message waiting for him. The Institute's board of directors wanted to meet with him immediately. As he made his way to the meeting room, his crystal body sparkled with nervous energy. The board's meeting room sat at the very top of the Institute's tallest tower. Its walls were made of smart glass that could become completely clear, giving a view of the purple mountains and 3 moons that hung in the pink sky. Today, however, the walls were cloudy, meaning this was a serious meeting. Inside, the board members sat around a floating table. There was Director Hao-Won, a being made of pure energy who glowed softly in shades of green. Next to her floated Director Jinwoo, whose gaseous form swirled with patterns of red and gold. At the head of the table sat the head director, Tahi, whose ancient crystalline form had grown so large over the centuries that she needed a special hovering platform to move around. "Professor Park," head director Tahi said, her voice ringing like deep cathedral bells, "we need to discuss your human student." Professor Park felt his crystal structure tighten slightly. Has Du Young done something wrong? Wrong. Director Jinwoo's gaseous form rippled with what might have been laughter. She has done something extraordinary. We have received messages from 17 different galactic universities asking about her teaching methods. Teaching methods? Professor Park asked, confused. Director Ha-won's energy form pulsed brightly. Yes, it seems that after solving your weekly challenge, Du Young started helping other students understand quantum computing in new ways. She has been holding study sessions in the library. Professor Park didn't know about this. He asked to see the library records, and Kita, who had followed him to the meeting, quickly brought up a holographic display. The recording showed Du Young sitting with groups of students from different species. She was teaching them how to think about quantum problems in new ways. For the crystallites, she used examples of light refraction. For the nebulans, she talked about gas flow patterns. For the Aquarians, she explained things using ocean currents. But most interesting, head director Tahi continued, is what happened when the students returned to their other classes. They started applying these new ways of thinking to different subjects. The biology students began using quantum computing ideas to understand cell behavior. The architecture students started designing buildings with distributed intelligence systems, like Du Young's Dyson sphere solution. Professor Park felt a warm glow spread through his crystal form. He had noticed that his students were thinking differently, but he hadn't realized how far the changes had spread. There's more, Director Jinwoo added, his gaseous form swirling faster with excitement. The human embassy has sent us information about Earth's educational methods. It seems humans have always learned this way, by making connections between different ideas, by thinking quickly, and by sharing knowledge freely. But how do they do it? Director Ha-won asked. How can beings with such short lifespans learn so much so quickly? Professor Park thought about what he had learned from watching Du Young. I think, he said slowly, it's because of their short lifespans that they learn this way. They don't have centuries to study one subject at a time like we do. They have to make connections quickly, find shortcuts, see patterns that others might miss. The board members were quiet for a moment, thinking about this idea. Finally, head director Tahi spoke again. Professor Park, we want you to start a new program at the Institute. We're calling it the Integrated Learning Initiative. We want you to work with Du Young to develop teaching methods that combine human quick thinking with our traditional thorough approach. Professor Park felt his crystal structure vibrate with surprise and excitement. This was a huge honor, but also a huge responsibility. What about my regular classes? He asked. Keep teaching them, head director Tahi said. But we want you to document everything. How Du Young thinks, how she solves problems, how she explains things to others. We need to understand this better. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was another teaching assistant, looking very excited. I'm sorry to interrupt, they said, but you need to see what's happening in the quantum lab. The board members and Professor Park hurried to the lab. Through the observation window, they could see Du Young working with a group of students from different species. She had set up a holographic display that showed quantum particles dancing in complex patterns. Watch this, she was saying to the other students. If we think about quantum entanglement like a family gathering at dinner, it makes more sense. Everyone at the table is connected, right? When one person reaches for the salt, it affects everyone else's movements. They might pass it along, or move their drinks to make space, or wait to take their next bite. Quantum particles work the same way. Each one's behavior affects all the others instantly. The board members watched in amazement as understanding dawned on the faces of the other students. Even species that didn't have families or eat meals could grasp the concept when it was explained this way. Remarkable, Head Director Tahi whispered. She's teaching quantum physics using dinner table manners. Professor Park felt proud as he watched his student teach. Du Young wasn't just sharing knowledge. She was building bridges between different ways of thinking, different species, different worlds. There's something else you should know, the teaching assistant said. The quantum processing systems in the lab. They're working 40% faster than before. Du Young suggested some changes to their configuration based on how human neural networks process information. Director Jin Woo's gaseous form swirled with excitement. 40% faster. That's impossible. Not for a human. Apparently, Professor Park said, his crystal form glowing warmly. I'm beginning to think nothing is impossible for them. As they watched, Du Young started explaining another concept, this time using dance movements to show how quantum particles could exist in multiple states at once. The other students joined in, their various forms moving in ways that perfectly demonstrated the physics principles they were learning. Professor Park realized that he was watching more than just a teaching session. He was watching the future of galactic education take shape, led by a species that most of the galaxy had once thought was too young, too quick, too different to contribute anything meaningful. How wrong they had all been. And how fortunate they were to learn this lesson now, while humans were still eager to share their knowledge and way of thinking with the rest of the galaxy. The end of the semester was approaching at the Galactic Institute of Advanced Studies. The purple mountains outside were covered in silver frost, and all 3 moons hung low in the pink sky. Inside Professor Park's office, the crystal-bodied professor sat reviewing student performance data with his assistant Kita. It's amazing, Kita said, his water suit bubbling with excitement. Every student's scores have improved since we started using Du Young's teaching methods. Even the students who were struggling at the start of the semester are now performing above average. Professor Park's crystal form glowed with pride. The past few months had changed everything he thought he knew about teaching. His human student, Du Young Lee, had not only solved complex problems in minutes, but had also helped create a whole new way of learning. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Du Young entered, carrying her tablet and wearing the same neat uniform she had worn on her first day. But something was different now. She walked with even more confidence, and other students from various species followed behind her. Professor Park, Du Young said, bowing slightly, we have something to show you. The professor noticed that the group included students from every major species at the institute, a crystallite whose form sparkled with excitement, a nebulon floating in their gas sphere, and even a young Aquarian who shared Kita's water-breathing nature. We've been working on a project together, Du Young explained. Remember how we improved the quantum processing systems in the lab? Well, we thought about how to apply that to the whole institute. The students gathered around as Du Young connected her tablet to the office's holographic display. A complex but beautiful pattern appeared in the air, showing the institute's systems working together in a new way. We call it the Unity Network, said the crystallite student, his voice chiming like small bells. It uses Du Young's ideas about distributed processing, but we added our own cultural understanding too. The nebulon students' gas sphere swirled with patterns as they spoke. I contributed ideas about gas flow dynamics, which helped improve the energy distribution. And I added what I know about water currents, the young Aquarian said, their fins moving gracefully. It helps the system adapt to changes more smoothly. Professor Park watched in amazement as the students explained their project. They had taken Du Young's original ideas and made them better by adding their own species' wisdom. This was exactly what Head Director Tahi had hoped would happen when she approved the Integrated Learning Initiative. But there's more, Du Young said, her eyes bright with excitement. We realized this system could work for more than just the Institute. We've designed it so it can be used by any school in the galaxy. Each planet can add their own cultural elements to make it work better for them. Just then, Head Director Tahi's large crystalline form appeared at the door, her hovering platform humming softly. I heard about this project, she said, her deep voice filling the room. The Galactic Education Council is very interested. Everyone turned to look at the head director. The Galactic Education Council was the highest authority on learning in the known universe. They rarely paid attention to student projects. They want to implement your Unity network in schools across the galaxy, head director Taddy continued. They believe it could revolutionize how different species learn from each other. Do-Young looked surprised. But it's not finished yet, she said. We still have so many improvements to make. Professor Park's crystal form vibrated with gentle laughter. That's exactly why it will work, Miss Lee. You've shown us that learning never stops. Even a finished project can always be improved with new ideas and perspectives. The head director nodded, causing rainbow patterns to dance across the walls. The council has also asked about starting an exchange program. They want to send teachers from different worlds to Earth to learn how humans think and teach. And they want more human students to come study at galactic universities. The other students in the room began talking excitedly about this news. The idea of more humans coming to study with them, and the chance to maybe study on Earth themselves, filled them with enthusiasm. Do-Young looked around at her fellow students, her teachers, and the project they had created together. When I first came here, she said quietly, I was worried about fitting in. I thought being human would make things difficult. Instead, Professor Park said, being human made things better. You taught us that different ways of thinking aren't obstacles, they're opportunities. Your quick solutions to problems weren't just about speed. They were about seeing connections that others missed. Kitaz's fins waved gently in his water suit. And you showed us that teaching isn't just about passing on knowledge. It's about building bridges between different ways of understanding the universe. Head Director Tahi's crystal form glowed warmly. The galaxy is changing, thanks to students like you, Do-Young. We thought we had to teach humans our ways. Instead, we learned that every species has something valuable to teach. Professor Park looked at his human student with new understanding. In just one semester, she had done more than solve complex problems quickly. She had helped create a new way for different species to learn from each other, to work together, to make the galaxy a better place. Miss Lee, he said, his crystal form glowing with all the colors of the rainbow. I believe I owe you an apology. When you first arrived, I worried that your human nature would be a problem. Now I understand that it was exactly what we needed. Do-Young smiled, that quick human expression that Professor Park had come to appreciate. No apology needed, Professor. We all learned together. That's what matters. As the pink sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the Institute's tall windows, Professor Park realized something important. The weekly challenge that Do-Young had solved in 5 minutes hadn't just been about quantum computing. It had been about breaking down barriers, about showing that different ways of thinking could work together to create something new and wonderful. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. That in a galaxy full of different species, different minds, and different ways of understanding the universe, the quickest solution wasn't always the most important thing. What mattered was how those differences could come together to create something better than any one species could create alone. The future of galactic education would never be the same, and it had all started because one human student wasn't afraid to think differently, work quickly, and share her knowledge with others.